lot changing relative to increasing energy efficiency of the enclosure per se. A lot of it really had to do more with clarification. The big one was really around there was a U-value equivalent in the code tables that was actually miscalculated in previous code versions. So there are numerous submissions. I think the 43 through 46 were all submissions on the same topic to change that U-value. That's important in the performance path calculation process. And then previously insulating sheathing was being used to describe the exterior insulation of buildings, and that has been changed throughout to a term called continuous insulation, which I think is a better terminology. There are insulation products that are not necessarily sheathing, but would qualify as continuous insulation around the building. And the last one was a clarification on R values in attic insulation. Apparently, the code table nominally states like an R38 or an R49, and that assumes that the insulation tapers down at the eaves of the building or at the soffits of the building and gives sort of an overall U-value. Overall R value might be R38. So if you have a raised shield truss, for example, that's R38 across the entire attic, that's equivalent to an R49 that tapers down at the soffit. Some code officials apparently were making builders who had raised hill soffits at the R38 level go up to R49 in addition because the table said R49. So the clarification there is, I think, important more on an inspection, from the inspection process. It doesn't really impact the actual R values that were being mandated. The next one on wall assemblies is the vinyl siding manufacturers who are putting together these insulated vinyl sidings have included that specifically in the code relative to a type of continuous exterior insulation and have inserted some information about testing and standards on those. There is better clarification on the wall sheathing about where you have braced wall panels on the exterior of a wall, how much exterior insulation, continuous insulation should go over those exterior wall panels where you do have that structural sheathing panels. And there was some concern in the corner and header insulation as to whether you could even fit any insulation in the corners or headers depending on the frame walls. That has been clarified as to basically putting insulation only in the gaps and voids that are in those headers or corners. The glazed door section, in the past, the doors were, the way the language worked, whether you had a glazed door or an opaque door, it all had to meet the same U value, and with glazed doors that was virtually impossible. So they've changed the language to make glazed doors more like windows. They call it fenestration, vertical fenestration now, as opposed to windows or doors. So if you have glazed doors, they're going to comply more with the window requirements. If you have opaque doors, those are going to comply on the opaque door section. There's a fairly large section on wind standards for foam sheathed walls. The NHB Research Center, again, has been doing a lot of that work and has a lot of prescriptive tables and standards for foam sheathing manufacturers to comply with if foam sheathing is going to be used to resist wind loading in some way, shape, or form. Typically, this is not for a lateral load or racking strength, but just for basic wind standards with the siding materials. And then finally, the continuous insulation language has been modified again in the vapor retarder table to really be more of a performance-based approach, allowing for having actual permeabilities in the footnotes as opposed to specific 2-pound density spray foams and others. again allowing for other materials to be used as continuing insulation, provided it has the appropriate vapor retardants. So next, there were some slight changes in water management, not a whole lot. One, I think, important one is the definition of shingle fashion. I think anybody who's been listening to the water management trainings and discussions are always hearing install stuff shingle fashion, but there's no actual definition for it. So there's a definition now in the code, and there have been some modifications, slight modifications in the flashings for a number of different materials and products to be used, and test methods to be referenced for flashing systems that are not specifically listed. One of the challenges in the code is that every manufacturer wants to have their product specifically named as a material or system that can be used in the code. So there's a lot of that. These are more of generic types of options that can be used by builders. So, next one. With the vinyl, insulated vinyl in the energy code, they also have included some attachment schedules and attachment standards for insulated vinyl siding in the building code. In addition, there's a fairly lengthy section in the building code, or the IRC, relative to how to attach cladding materials, different siding materials, over foam sheathing, given that the foam doesn't really have any structural strength and you need to tie back to the framing. They have tables of fasteners and sizes and different weights of materials. So that's a good thing to have in the code, that if you're doing foam sheathing, you've now got something to, pardon the pun, hang your hat on for hanging cladding materials onto the side of the building over a foam sheathing product. Next. Another change and this impacts both code minimum and Energy Star to some extent. Historically, the code had stated that the floor insulation had to be in contact with the surface that was attached to the conditioned living space. So that upper slide shows the typical installation of how the code required it. The challenge was that if you're in a garage or an overhang where you've got some mechanical systems or other things you want to keep within the conditioned space of the building, you really can't do that. And so this code change allows for the insulation to be dropped to the underside of that assembly to be able to encapsulate mechanical systems, provided that the vertical element of the rim joist is treated in the same way as the wall assembly above it. So it makes sense. It follows good building science, and I think allows a lot of flexibility and opportunities within garages, overhangs, things like that, to be routing mechanicals and keeping them within the conditioned space of the building, especially duct systems where you may have to be demonstrating more of the duct inside the conditioned space than outside. Next one on roofs was not a whole lot changed there, primarily in the southern climates. If there are what I would consider flat roofs, low slope cathedral roofs, they cut anything lower than 2 in 12 that is directly above a conditioned space does need to have a radiant coating to it. And there are also some changes to the R values, but in the unvented roof assembly section, there's a methodology for calculating how much air impermeable insulation should be applied to a compact unvented roof assembly versus the air permeable insulation for roofs with lower R values than what the code had been calculated for. Generally, the roof R values have been more on the R38, R49 levels and how much insulation was required there, but there is methodologies for calculating those, how much R value you need above and air impermeable insulation versus the air permeable insulation in those assemblies. And then finally, there was a modification that was accepted, which I think is a good one, that the table 402.4.1.1, the air barrier and insulation criteria, historically these had been combined, and this person took this, I believe this was actually from a code official, and changed this table to have the air barrier criteria in one column, the insulation criteria in another. Now, a lot of the code changes that I just went through have some aspect of them, some aspect of that code change was part of this table. So it's going to be incumbent on ICC and perhaps the authors to, in reviewing that, how would their code change relate to this split table. But I think it's helpful to be able to understand what are your insulation-specific activities and what are your air barrier-specific activities. So that was the...
Nice to Duncan's point that a building code official realized there was confusion on their end of the marketplace and tried to fix it in this way.
Yep.
So hopefully that will help with some of the issues that you guys have with them in the field as to understanding how you're actually meeting the code requirements since the two things are split.
Yep. So.
That was a lot in enclosures. And obviously we didn't go through everything. I don't know if anyone has any questions for Duncan on what was discussed, any concerns about enclosures and codes right now, or anything else you want to talk about, or if you've been looking at the codes as well, anything you think we've missed that is a valid thing to bring up. So again...
Betsy, this is Marty.
It's Marty? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question for Duncan concerning the requirement for a radiant barrier on low-sloped roofs in climate zones 1, 2, and 3. Is that a mandate even if you have air impermeable insulation in direct contact to the roof deck?
Yeah, it's really it's primarily what they're looking for is an emissivity of the roof. So they are looking, regardless of the insulation type, they're trying to make sure that you've got a high level of reflectance of the solar gain off of the roof. And that could be, you know, in your example, I think what we typically think of as a radiant barrier is the foil-faced sheathing that goes on the top of the roof that requires a 1-inch airspace to make it work. In the case that you're talking about where the insulation is directly applied to the roof, what would need to happen is that the roof material itself would need to have a high, a higher level of reflectivity. That could be, and usually if these are low-slope roofs, these are going to be, you know, EPDM or some kind of a modified bitumen.
So in other words, it has a minimum emissivity requirement, period.
Right. It's a minimum emissivity. It doesn't specifically state how you get there. It just states what it is.
So you could have a cool roof system and qualify.
Exactly.